And there'll be ways to get started hacking as well that might be different than those other ones. So that way you have some methods of getting into their boxes that aren't patched yet, so you guys can get the persistence points. I think it's just a really good learning experience overall to have this offense and DevSec experience. If you don't want to do offensive, you can have your team members to do that for you. Or if you don't want to do defensive, maybe you can convince your teammates to just do the defensive for you. Or if you want to just hop back and forth, that's all right too.
Austin, we need to do this card.
Anything else you guys want to mention about Saturday?
Should be fun. Come show up, even if you don't know anything. That's how you learn stuff.
We will not be competing. We'll be going around and paying very close attention to all of you.
Yo, that sounds kind of weird. Actually, we'll only be paying really close attention to Johnny. We're just going to be sitting next to him.
Yo,
Johnny's watching him.
Let's go.
No, we will be there. So if you have questions about stuff or don't understand checklists we have, or just don't know what to do, then there will be a few of us there that can help you.
There will also be other schools competing if you want to establish DC dominance.
Yeah.
Yeah, there won't be.
Are they is this physical? Are they going to be there?
No. Other schools will be remote, but we will be in Beacom. And hopefully we'll actually have wired access into the IA lab. So if you want to do some hacking from local, assuming you have a Cali VM, yeah, fun stuff.
Yes,
So it's a free for all, or are we supposed to or is separated by school teams basically?
So there's teams of 4.
Yeah.
You're all going into, it's a free for all, yeah. Your team is against everyone else. They could be hacking you, you could be hacking them.
Other schools, let's just fight each other, okay?
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
We just kill all the other schools.
Yeah, so
then fight each other.
Oh, okay.
you'll get points for keeping stuff online on your boxes, so keeping your services up. But you'll also get points for getting access to other people's boxes.
Is it an equal amount of points, or is it
Undecided. We haven't figured out the exact scoring rubric yet. But if you have access to someone else's box and can hit the scoring engine from it, probably by executing
then they lose more points.
file that will give you, then you'll get points for your team also. So lots of ways to get points, blue team and red team.
There may be snacks if that's what is going to sell you to come. There may be Mountain Dew, some cookies, and other assorted things.
Why you say that? Will there be pizza? Probably not.
TBD.
I wouldn't trust them even if they said they would.
Alright, so this is the new attendance.devsec.club. It's called, I believe, is this right? Cybernet.devsec.club. So this is what we're using from now on. This is how we'll deploy your VApps and track who's been to the meetings. If you guys want to fill it out now, here's your chance. I think it asks for a secret. You can put DevSec ! The class is DW120.
Yeah, that's the only event.
So welcome to Defending Windows in 100 clicks or fewer. I didn't actually count, so give or take. So why do we use Windows? Windows is very popular because it has Active Directory and it's very good at managing tons of boxes at once. Like if you have 100 users, you can put them all in one forest or domain and control them all from one computer, which is significantly better than going around and clicking and running commands on every single box individually. So it's just very good for group management. Windows is a huge consumer base. Even if you don't like it, you probably have used it before. Raise your hand if you haven't used Windows.
Oh, wait a minute.
Exactly. Only liars. So you're kind of forced to use it, especially if you're a pen tester or you're an admin. You're going to need to use it eventually. You just got to fact of life. You're stuck using Windows for now. So CCDC bubble problem. CCDC stands for the Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. It's kind of a blue teaming team or blue teaming competition where schools will send out a team, in this case remotely, and there'll be a red team who hacks over 2 days your team's boxes and all the rest of the teams, and they'll try to take over your boxes and persist for as long as possible. Well, our job is to kick them out. Well, we might not necessarily do that in the best means that are the most realistic for the real world. For example, running a script to reset the firewall every 5 seconds. So a red team, they obviously need to open up ports, and if you have really good rules set, they're going to just try opening a port. Well, in real world, you have to have approval and disapproval, what ports are open and close. Well, in a competition like this, you can just constantly reset all the firewall rules every 5 seconds, so that way red team can't get in. Another one is changing user passwords randomly every minute. In real world, users might not be so happy that They have a two-factor authentication token that just changes every minute. They try to log in. It's like a 20-character password. They're trying to type it and it changes again. Might be a little annoyed at you. Another one is not using domain group policy. So in competitions, usually we're too lazy to set domain GPO, especially when that can cause problems and it'll slow down securing individual boxes. So we usually let each individual box have its own policies. So that way it's faster to set for the individual and remove things. As a whole, it kind of slows down the process when you only have like 3 boxes that are connected to the domain. If there was more, like 100, it also would be something that, at that point, you'd probably use domain. I remember another decision we did, CCDC, last year, is when there's a service account called the KRBTGT or something, and their password is supposed to be the same because they're responsible for like signing every message from the domain controller, and typically you want your message to be double checked, but this can be used if the red team is able to leak this account's password. They can use this to sign any message to any server and just take control over it, basically. So what I did is I set up a script to just change this user's password like every 30 seconds, just in case the red team was able to get one of these, get their password and use it. In real world, that would break your domain very badly, but when you're only running with like 2 boxes, it's fine. As a whole, competitions like CCDC are a great way to learn, but they're not necessarily teaching the most realistic aspects of the environment, but they're a good way to like learn more than what you typically just sitting at a desk all day. So priorities in these kind of environments are as follows. These are our basic guidelines: is password changes, service hardening, firewall setup, persistence removal, and monitoring. Obviously, this isn't like a very linear process. You go 1 through 5 maybe, and you like go back to the start again. Once you realize where they are and how they're getting in, kind of just loop back to password changes and service hardening, because red team will constantly be leaking your passwords, just removing hardening from your services. They'll be adding ports, and you got to redo the process over and over again. So on the right, you see this little graphic. This is kind of what we're going over. You can see there's entry, persistence, and the different methods of each. So for PowerShell is a very powerful tool in the sysadmin's arsenal. We won't necessarily be going over how PowerShell fits into all of the 5 steps, but I will be going over what they can be used for certain steps, that it helps break down some of the tedious processes like changing user passwords. If you have 100 users on your domain, it takes a long time to go through and click every single button to change the user's password, especially if you want to change them to all unique passwords and to create a list of that. If you type up once, you're going to lose that user's password. And so scoring engines for CCDC will authenticate to your box sometimes and like, hey, does this user's password work? And if it doesn't work because you typed it wrong, you'll be like, why is a single user not authenticating? And you're losing points during the time. Also, it's a lot easier to just hit up arrow a few times and hit enter on this command again to rerun the commands and go through the GUI and click every single button and try to figure out where you were. So why use PowerShell? There's memorable commands, object-based output, simple piping of command output, logic, scripting, and easy to make a GUI. If you're into that kind of thing, usually I don't go through the process of making a GUI because it's still a pain in the butt, and I'm not good at making designs. I'll be going over the first, I believe, 3 of the 6 that I have here. So, memorable commands. What do I mean by that? Everybody knows in Windows command prompt or Linux, all the commands are just random. Like if you want to list users, it's a net user. Like how are you supposed to memorize these commands that command prompt gives you? Well, PowerShell has a nice layout. It's verb-noun. What I mean by that is the layout will be get-local user if you want to get the list of users, or select-object, format-table. It's always that verb-noun. So it's very easy to remember a group of commands or what that command does. You'll know what it does because you can just read it. And most commands, if you like get-local user, there's like an equivalent of delete-local user. So like one command doesn't do like 7 different things. You have to remember which of that command does the 7 things you're looking for. The picture shows that PowerShell has tab completion. Command prompt has tab completion for the executable, but PowerShell has that along with it can tab complete your flags. So you can see here there's a dash at the end of the second line, and you can see all the different things that you can put for those flags. And also, I believe some of them have the options as well for that. Another reason PowerShell is superior than GUI or command prompt is its object-based output. So what that means is you don't have to use like cut, grep. It's a nice clean output that's very easy to work with on a scripting level. If you're working with Batch or Linux, all the output you're dealing with is text-based. It's a lot of work to get to the good stuff of your output, which is why PowerShell is superior, because if I open up PowerShell, you can see, nope, not. No. Got to make it bigger. There we go. So if I type like get-local user to get the list of local accounts on my system, you can see that's in this nice column layout. And if I want to select one of these groups, you can say, if I want to select just the usernames, I can do -name, and I can select only the column. So instead of having to like cut each section, like, oh, I want to cut the top 2 lines to get rid of that name and the slashes, and I want to cut the enabled and description. Well, in Linux, you have to use like the cut and with a delimiter of a space, and then select the first object, which is super ugly, and you kind of have to forget. You forget what it does. And if they update the command the slightest, like if they move something around, your script is gonna break because it's garbage to be using cuts all the time. So you can see in Batch, this is kind of what you have to do to strip parts of characters. I believe this one cuts. I think it cuts a tab delimited file like net user down to the space. So it would make a list from this. It would be administrator, new line, Austin, new line, Austin, new line, bad guy. So it's kind of like changes that. When in PowerShell, it can be done in significantly less characters. And if you want to make a list like that in a GUI, you better get typing. Especially if there's 100 users on the box, you're going to have to cram a lot of keys. So in PowerShell and Batch, it scales a lot better than the GUI. So simple piping of command output. You can kind of see a bit of this in Linux, where it's easier to pipe output from one command to the other, so that we can have like your standard in, standard out. Batch or command prompt, it really sucks because you have to do a lot of. It's easier to work with variables and pass those in because you have to do a lot of manipulation. Is that don't cut. You don't have to cut and grep your output to clean it up. Like I said for the Linux. So that's all I have about PowerShell. Does anyone have any questions on any basics of PowerShell? All right, so we're moving into the lab. DW101. All right, that's wrong. It's DW120. Fill out cybernet.devsec.club, and you should see it as your username. DW120. Oh, DW underscore your username is what you should see under the h5.devsec.club.
Does anyone expect to have it that doesn't?
So if you want to follow along, you should be able to do it. So in this VApp is going to be an Active Directory domain controller. So if you happen to have one of those on your laptop for some weird reason, you feel free to use that.
Did you click the join for the event? Yeah, so if you want the VApp, you got to click join on the events inside of it. That may have been omitted.
I'll wait a couple minutes for everybody to get that pulled up if they want. Again, it's h5.devsec.club, or if you go to the IA Lab list of different orgs, which you'll see like learn projects. If you scroll down a bit, we'll be there under DevSec, so it's another way to find it. And if you don't feel like filling out their attendance link, you can go to in VApp, there's a catalog option, and you can clone it yourself. That's a bit harder to do, and if you have a question on how to do that, you can ask one of these gentlemen up front. While we wait, does anyone have any jokes to give?
I was gonna say something.
Jane, you have lots of jokes. Let's hear it.
He's a funny guy.
It's not so easy.
Why do cannibals not eat clowns?
Because they taste funny.
They taste
All right, good one.
So weird.
What's the password of the thing?
It's gonna be password one bang.
For the capital.
Yep. So the password for the domain controller will be password one bang with a capital P.
That's so nasty.
So if you got into the domain controller, this is your computer, which you must defend. I didn't set up as many vulnerabilities as the Hivestorm boxes that we had set up, I believe, last week. So there's only a couple that I put on here for you guys to fix and find. There's also no scoring engine, so I'll believe you if you say you fixed them. So the first of the 5 steps that I'll be talking about today will be password changes. So why do you need to change your passwords anyway? Like, why can't I have the same password when bang, or just no password? Well, people use your credentials to gain remote execution to your computer. What that means is they can remotely just run commands, take over, do whatever they want at that user's level. So if you had the password for the administrator of your computer, they could probably brute force that right away, get control, and take over your computer, which you don't want, because Red Team will immediately have administrative level access. There's a lot of different ways. Even if you disable RDP, there could be a PowerShell, there could be WinRM, PSExec, SSH. Those are all things that use your passwords in Windows, which you may not look for immediately. You'll be like, oh, I disabled the remote desktop, I'll be fine. But not necessarily. According to Shane, it is the #1 hack of all time is having default credentials or just poor creds in general.
Are you saying you didn't like this presentation?
So if you want to change your passwords manually, you can go to Cortana and type compmgmt.msc, or if you hit Windows Run locally. However, that doesn't work in iLab because it'll just open up on your home computer, or on the host machine. If you want, you can right-click the Windows icon on the bottom right and hit Run. There's also to change web app passwords, WordPress, change application passwords, FileZilla. You'll have to look these up because individual applications, these change greatly. It could be from a different file in the system, or get to go log in on a web app somewhere and change it. See this graph on the right-hand side. Different groups. The green means that ones we're patching, and the yellow ones means we're working on patching. This is kind of like the steps broken down. So if you guys don't want to go through necessarily, there's only one user on the box, but in a real world environment there's going to be a lot more, like CCDC. Well, if you want to change all the local user passwords, use this first command, which won't work on the domain controller because domain controllers don't have local users, they only have Active Directory users. So the second command is to change all the Active Directory users in the whole domain at once with one password, which you obviously wouldn't do in a real environment, but CCDC is not a real environment, like we said, of the whole downsides of what we do in CCDC is not necessarily what you would want to actually do in the real world. So to break down these commands a bit, you can see the set-local user-password. That's what the flag, that's I accidentally typed that wrong. It's get-local user and pipe that and set-local user. There we go. So what that does is it gets the list of all the local users on the box. So I can do here, get-local user. I showed that earlier. So you can see it lists them all nicely. Well, you don't need to do any of that garbage cut or delimiting like I said earlier. PowerShell, you can just pipe it directly into another command, and depending on the command, I can just figure it out. So if I can do set-local user read host as secure string, close it up. So what this does is, like I said, it passes the list into set local user. But this parenthesis read-host as secure string is reading in the password from standard in. It's as secure string is just it basically is like a kind of encryption for the set local user. That's just how it wants the password flag, which is what you'll find in some basic googling. So I won't run this on my host machine. I'll run the -whatif command, and this shows me what would happen if I didn't have this flag. So if I ran it, you'd see there's no error, but there's a blinking cursor. This means it's working and it's looking for a password. So if I type password on bang, hit enter, you can see that this whatif, and it shows every user, and it says modifying local user. So it's basically changing all the passwords successfully for all the users on my computer, which means that this command worked. Now if I remove the whatif, it would change all my passwords, which I do not want. So for the Active Directory command, also, if you guys want to type this out, it's on the commands.txt on the desktop with the domain controller, so it would make it a bit easier than typing up these long commands yourself. So I'm going to switch to the domain controller. So while that's loading, I'll explain this command a bit. So you can still read it. So the get 8-80 user-filter star is kind of similar to get local user, but the filter is required so that way you're selecting all of the users on the domain, and you have to specify like the OU, like the operational organization or anything like that. It just selects every user that's connected to the Active Directory, and then it pipes into that out-grid view-pass-through. So what that is this is for selecting specific users, because in a domain environment there are service users that you can't necessarily change the password to all at once, and it'll need to be set at a different time. So that's just an easier way of selecting what users you do and do not want to change. You may want your administrators to have a different password than your regular users, so that way if they compromise one password or the user password, they don't have all the passwords at once. So if I go to the domain controller, password on bang, so if I go to my commands, I can copy that hopefully. It'll be the second line of the file. We'll open this in PowerShell. First, I'll go to my properties, I believe, and up my font size to, let's say, 36 be readable. Is that better? Yeah, I can read that. I'm trying to get my... nope, doesn't want to scale. Alright, so I type that in, hit enter. Oh, can't make it blank. So I hit enter, hit this the password, one bang. So you can see this. Whoops. Apparently the Active Directory decided to disable itself. I believe that's because, is it because it doesn't have internet? Would that be an issue?
Can't reach the DC, it wouldn't have Active Directory.
It is the DC. What do you? See if I can fix this real quick. Looks like the domain controller service did not start up, so let's see if starting this will work. Nope. Alright, I guess I'll have to skip that. So I won't be able to demo that one, sadly. But so what would happen is it gets the list of users and it'll pull it up in a little screen, little window where you can control on many users. Like if you would in File Explorer, you can open it up and hold Control and select multiple. Or if you shift click top of the like one and another one, it'll select them all. And those the ones you select are the ones that you'll change the new password to. So I find the password change script super helpful in like CCDC. When at minute 0, every second counts to change the user's password as fast as you can. Because as soon as Red Team knows your password, they'll get a shell in your box, and they'll use that to get root. So next up is service hardening. So why do you need to harden these services? Why can't you just run them as they are? So every website is running on a web server, or a web service also. So there's a lot of different services out there. There's SSH, RDP, FTP, SMTP, HTTP, or like Apache are examples of ones. A service is something running in the background. In this context, it's usually something that's talking on the network. Like SSH, like those are the ones we really care about in this context. Because if Red Team can't hit them, they may not be a big deal for a little while with the competition. Because Red Team is not necessarily going to pivot inside your network until like halfway through the first day or like day 2 of the competition. They won't necessarily like they'll be they'll be focusing on getting persistence and not necessarily pivoting to boxes that they don't have access to yet. So we mainly focus on the ones that are outbound, like SSH and RDP. They may be required. So those are kind of like our first ones we got to focus on. So why do we harden them? Makes your computers less vulnerable by modifying different configs. So on SSH, for example, you'll want to disable root logon as fast as you can, change your passwords. Like RDP, if your passwords are weak, you'll want to fix that. If you have FTP, like anonymous read-write, you don't want the red team to be able to write anywhere on your C drive, which is a thing that you can set up in Windows. You can have anyone remotely be allowed to just write to your drive without any authentication, which would be an issue. I might have to change the passwords like we talked about earlier, so you have to change those for something more secure. So one of the things that you have to look for when you're hardening services is web shells. So for PHP, example, they would be just like a single line of code where if they went to the web server, they could be running commands like they'd put like your web server /index.php $cmd equals like directory, for example, or ls, and they can just run commands right as the web server. And in most cases, it'd be like www data, but if it was set up poorly, maybe it's possible that this web server is running as root, which would be an issue because then they can easily establish persistence on your box. So to find web shells, your like Windows Defender might find them, depends on, but you'll have to probably scroll through your web server looking for those little file, like single lines of code which you can find examples all over the internet of what they look like. There's not necessarily a good way to find that using PowerShell. It's just you have to scroll through your root directory and look for different things they can find. Moving on. So you better configure and patch. There's a lot of steps that you can mess up and make mistakes on. You just got to hope that before you can find them, that red team doesn't beat you to it. And if they do, make sure you're looking through your logs, trying to figure out what they did so that way you can go back and patch it again. So a big one is fix php.ini. There is an option in there to disable functions. So you can disable like system, shell exec, and a whole list. There's secure examples of php.ini files that you can download from the internet, which have all these things disabled. So that way, if there is any, they won't. You can basically tell PHP it is not allowed to run these commands. So that way, it's impossible for web shells to exist on your server because they're not allowed to run commands. So they can't be run in ls just as the server. You can also dig through your web root to make sure there's no like backups that shouldn't exist on there. Like you don't want your Etsy shadow file to exist in your web server, or like different random backups that would help them see what users there are available. You also want to disable some. You want to look through all the versions of your server, looking for vulnerable versions like Samba, for example, or the new Apache 2.29, 2.4.49, where they just get code execution. So you'll kind of like go through and make sure all your services are updated to the newest version. For an example, you can disable Samba pretty easily with that one command. However, this Samba may be required for CCDC, so you'll have to upgrade to the newer version, which you can do by changing the 1 to a 3 and then setting the false to a true, so it's not that bad. It may not say it's required explicitly, but if we're working with a domain controller, it may be. Samba is required for domain controllers to talk to different boxes, so you have to pay attention to that as well. Like I said earlier, you want to disable anonymous read-write to FTP servers. They may be required, but if it is, make sure you limit the scope as much as possible so that way your FTP servers can't be writing to things like they shouldn't. Like if they can write to your shadow file and read it, that's pretty bad. Windows, there's a lot of different Samba shares that are available. Then they could be sharing any server. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to see. So if you want, you can go to Windows R or Runbox and then type comp mgmt.msc again. And if you go under shared folders, shares, you can see all the different shares that exist that Red Team will be able to connect to. The ones with $ are default in Windows, and you not necessarily remove them. If you can disable it entirely if you want to be certain that they can't access any shares. But normally you can right click and select stop sharing, so that way it's removed. Or if they are required, I would make sure you look through the permissions to double check that the permissions are correct and if it's not anonymous or it is anonymous, or just limit the scope as much as possible. Remove. So if it's a malicious server, this code can be bad, disabling firewall, adding users, etc. So you'll want to look through different services in Windows. I have a couple PHP or PowerShell one-liners that basically strip down all the. It gets a list of all the services in Windows and then removes all the default ones, and so that you can see all the new services that are existing. So you can make sure all the services that are there aren't like some red team persistence that's there to disable the firewall over a period of time, or just like sets a single user's password back. Because if you're not paying close attention to your logs, you're not going to notice that a single user's password is being changed, or if it's adding a user that it shouldn't. That's something that will be difficult to see in the long term of things. So, principle of leaf functionality is just remove as much as you can without that just meets the basic requirements of the environment. So, big items: disable any remote connections you don't need, like SSH, RDP, WinRM if that's not required. So, it's mainly for servers that you need WinRM. But you don't need it. You can set servers manually, so you can disable WinRM if you want. If you don't need web servers, remove them. FTP, basically any file sharing, you'll want that to go away. They'll have really random services required. Like I believe last year they required chess. There was like a chess service that you could like execute code on.
We did chess.
Yeah, they just play chess against red team. So, number 3, firewall setup. So you can't always just be relying on your Palo guy or external firewall to just do all the work for you, because if red team is in your network on one of your boxes, they're past the Palo for most cases, and they can pivot pretty easily externally. So you want to make sure it's turned on first of all on firewall, and make sure there's no like allow all rules from external internal, so that way red team can just bypass all the rest of your rules because you have an allow all hidden in there. Which if you're in Windows, if you know anything about Windows firewall rule, or Windows Firewall, there is a lot of different rules that can just bury it. And it can just be a single line here, just allow all, and you'll probably miss it. So, by default, it's inbound blocks all unless drop all by default, and then outbound is allowed by default. Eventually, you'll want to limit your outbound ports, so that way red team can just like, once they get on your box, you don't want them to be able to just like call to any shell. You want to make it slightly more difficult for them by blocking as many outbound ports as you can, so that way they can only speak outbound on like certain ports. So I have some PowerShell scripts to reset the firewall basically. So it's kind of 3 steps. You can reset all 3 profiles, disables all inbound, outbound rules, and then it creates new rules, disables all the inbound rules by default, I believe. And then creates a new rule that allows certain ports inbound. So what this does is, if by default Windows Server will be like, oh, do you want inbound, outbound rules, or like how different logging works on each firewall? That first command will basically set that back to default what Windows has, which is significantly better than whatever may be on the box by default, which could be disabled. And then this disables all the rules, so that way nothing will call in. And the third one will create new rules, which you see that 80, 443, and 25 are just the examples I had. You may want to add all the services that you have on your on the box, so that way you don't get docked points, because that could be something you'd miss. So in this case, this box is running like an SMTP server and Apache. So you can see that if you have like a UDP service, you have to change that to TCP, which is not necessarily as common, but could be a thing to pop up. If you want, you can also run this on the server, so we can try that out. So if we go to wf.msc, hopefully wait for it to pop up. And then we'll go to the desktop and then copy these commands. So I'm going to start out with copying just as, actually, I guess in the document they have them all on one line, I believe. Yep. So just do them all at once. That's what I usually run it as, because they basically do the same thing. They all reset the firewall, so I just had them spread out to explain what each part of the command did. So if I run wf.msc, there we go. So you can see in this case the Windows Defender firewall is all off. All the profiles are disabled, and I broke some rules on them. So if I went to my my PowerShell, sent this command in, rerun it, we can hope that it resets them all. We'll find out. Looks like the first one broke. So the rules will be disabled. The rules will be fixed. However, the profiles might not be up. Okay, cool. Yeah, so it reset all the firewalls properly, so that way they're all back on, and the default outbound is allowed, and then the inbound is denied by default, which is how it is normally. So if we look at our outbound rules, our inbound rules, you can see that all of them are disabled except for services. If you're running in an Active Directory environment, this will be different. You'll need to specify different. You'll have to look up a list of ports that Active Directory require, which I believe is like Samba and a couple other random ones like RDP. And it's kind of for like remote management of the group policy. So you have to just pay attention and be mindful of that so that we don't break your Active Directory environment. So before I move on, I'll quickly run through what these commands mean. So you can see this set-net firewall profile and this new object. So what is that? It's generating a new firewall object for the default policy of Windows, and it's restoring what the original is, and it's setting that as the new one, which is the easiest way to do it for some weird reason. Don't ask me who decided to make that the best solution for setting the firewall. It's just what they went with. And disabling all the firewall rules is pretty straightforward. Like I said, there's that verb-noun, so just disabling that firewall rule, and it'll just select them all. There are flags if you want to disable specific rules, but this is just how I want to do it. And then the next one is new-net firewall rule, and then display name, direction, inbound, local port. If you want, I can specify outbound as well with this, but there's, depending on your environment, it changes a bit more. Like if this server needed to reach, for example, if this server needed to have users on it and it needed to reach different outbound ports, like you'll need to allow HTTP outbound on all the ports, or HTTPS outbound on like the upper region of ports, like those upper 40,000 ports where Chrome uses to connect outbound. Some CCDC will require that. They won't necessarily check it, but best to follow the rules. Does anyone have any questions on the setting the firewall rules? Nope. Alright, so 4 to 5 is persistence removal. So persistent annihilation, there are way too many methods of persistence to be going over in this presentation. It could be an entire club by itself. So a couple different tools we go over is sysinternals, just a suite built by Microsoft to help admins do their thing that aren't necessarily built directly into Windows. One of the best ones, in my opinion, is like autoruns. You can catch malicious programs and run, and autoruns will find different ways that programs start up by default, and it will just watch them. Or I'll show you what's starting up, and if you want, it's a one-click to disable that from starting up on default. This catches a good number of different persistence mechanisms that start up on default. It won't catch services, but besides that, it gets a good number of them. If you find like batch scripts, PS1, PowerShell, there's a lot of different like .bbs are all different script things that can run on Windows. .dxe, .dll. There's a lot of different things that you can like name an executable and still run and get a shell. They're usually never good news. If you find them, this probably means red team's in your box, and you'll want to look for different methods they use, because red team will never just have one way to call back on your box. Because the saying for red team is 1 is none and 2 is 1. So if they'll have methods. They'll have several different methods hidden around your box to get callbacks, because they don't want to lose their one method into your box. So one way to annihilate persistence is red team will try to mess up your Windows Defender as much as possible, or like your malware because they don't want their payloads to get picked up, which is something that would screw them over, because if they got all their methods picked up, then they couldn't get any callbacks. So what they do is mess with your Windows Defender. So Windows Defender has like exclusions. You can exclude like the C drives, that way it won't scan any of your C drive, which would be an issue. They can stop it from scanning specific file formats. They can disable scanning overall, which would be like real-time scanning. They can disable cloud scanning, and all that is something if you missed that and you didn't realize your Windows Defender wasn't working, it would let them keep getting back in your box. So what you have to do, these 3 commands remove excluded paths, extensions, processes. So before I show you the commands, I can do it by manually. So if I go to the Windows Defender, or the domain controller, close this. Windows Security is what they renamed it to, I believe. So you can see that virus and threat protection are off, so we can turn that on if we wanted to, but manage settings, scroll down, and you can see that there's exclusions right here. So it's kind of buried option where you won't necessarily see it right away if you're not looking for it, and you won't be able to tell that it's just not scanning any of your C drive or any .ps1, which is PowerShell scripts. So that means anything running on your system won't be scanned because it's just excluding everything. So might not necessarily be only 2. If it was only 2, I'd remove them by hand because it's a lot shorter. But if you want, if there's like 1,000, it's a lot easier to use these commands because it's the best way to remove them in bulk. So it's kind of ugly. It's the best way I found of removing the exclusions. So to break it down, first it gets the -mp preference, which is just a way to list the different exclusions. MP preference. This is going to be a long list of things. You have to kind of scroll through looking for different things. You can see the exclusion paths. You can see the C colon that we showed earlier. So if we want to just select that, we can do, I'll have to put parentheses around it. I believe it's, exclusion path, all right? All right, so now I see our C colon. Well, if there's a long list here, I'd pull them all up. So what you have to do is do this for each, which it's kind of jank how it has to be done because it has to be passed in as a specific, it has to be passed in as a string, because the remove -mp preference, for most commands in PowerShell, you can just pass things in as objects fairly easily. However, this one of the commands, this command right here, does not accept you can't just pass objects in. So it's one of those things you have to do jankily, which you'd see very commonly in like Linux or Windows or like command prompt. So it patches in for each, so it passes in like if there's multiple, like there's C colon, like specific folders, it would pass them in one by one into this expression. So this invoke expression is just calling the command inside of it. And we have to call the command inside of it because it's building as a string and then passing to the invoke expression. So you can see that we're removing the -exclusion path. And for example, that C drive would be there as the variable, which is that $underscore, which is a variable it's like the last thing. It's like what's being passed into it is that variable. And then it's just that -4, so it forcibly removes it. And then it just does that for every single thing in the exclusion list. So if we go to over here and copy and paste that command, run it, see there's no errors. If we go back to our Windows security, actually if we just go up and go to that get mp preference .exclusion path, it's empty. So it successfully was able to remove the exclusion for the entire C drive. If we want, we can go back here and remove this other one, or do it with the commands. And then turn on our threat protection. And also I disabled the rest of them, which you'd think if you click the one button, it would enable all of them so you feel like you're safe, but nope. You gotta make sure you go in and turn on all the different settings as well if you're blue teaming. You gotta make sure you have a wide range of defenses that will hopefully stop blue team. There's another option here where you can disable changing settings on Windows security by the command line, which basically slows down red team because they'll be using everything via like PowerShell and command line. And there's a setting that if you enable it, stops them from being able to go through and immediately change those settings instantly. They'll have to open up a GUI and click the option manually, which slows them down because they have to deal with like 6 different teams if they all had to do that. And a dozen different boxes. It hampers their progress a bit, and it may catch a couple of their payloads to stop them because they can't just automatically turn off Defender. So if you move on to the next slide. So last stage is monitoring. So once you get all the steps done, you feel like you removed all the persistence and you feel like your services are generally secure. You're not sure where to look. Next, you basically monitor logs and monitor the ports on your system. So on the domain controller, I do have TCP view and other system terminal tools set up. It's on the desktop. You want to just click through them and see what they do. So TCP view looks at the network traffic, and it can show you all the different ports and what's going on. Are they listening? Are they transmitting? Where are they connected to? Where's the destination port they're talking to? So that we can kind of see that information, like where's my box connected to, and that's good to know. Like if you see if you see your 443 outbound working and you don't have Chrome open, that may be red team using your box to talk outbound to another server or red team. There's also one Komodo kill switch. It kind of shows all the untrusted processes that aren't known by Microsoft or different tools. Like if it's never seen this process before, it'll report that to you and be like, hey, you might want to check this out. I've never seen this, and it could be like a red team or a different program that's not supposed to be running. Windows Defender, make sure it's on first of all because it'll help you greatly. It'll slow down red team. So if you've never heard of Blue Spawn is an endpoint detection response. It's a really cool command line tool that does a bit more than what Windows Defender does, and it'll kind of search for different tools in a stranger way than what we're used to. And it'll kind of look for what processes are doing and what they're connecting to. And if you leave it running for long enough, it'll start picking up more and more tools like, hey, why is this suddenly started? Or like, where did this come from? So it's good to know. Also, it's best to have multiple antivirus software. Or I mean, it's not best, but in this environment, it's helpful to have multiple because if they go in and disable your Windows Defender, they weren't necessarily ready for you to have a Malwarebytes running as well or like a different product. It's not as easy to possibly weren't ready to disable that one. So if they disable Windows Defender, it might be picked up by Malwarebytes or vice versa. So I'll help you there. I lied of 6. This is the last one, I swear. So this is where we fill the holes. It takes the longest and it's the hardest to get right. This is where we do like the group policy management, and this is kind of the most boring and tedious part of my opinion. It's easy to script in the long term, but it's a lot longer of a script than one line. And so you have to basically create a config and then import it. If you're come before the competition, have this config ready to import. It was if I show you here, I can go to gpedit.msc, and I can show you that there's a long list of different. If I expand a little arrow, go to my system. Nope. Thing. Fine. Let's go to security settings. Nope. Am I sure? All right. Here's a good one. Control panel. You can see that there's all these options in different folders, and there's more depending on which one. So it's kind of like a boring process of you going through, making sure these are all right. There's an option here where you can disable Windows Update, which would be an issue because you want to make sure, if you're a Windows you want to make sure your services are up to date, so that there's no vulnerabilities available for them. There's ones where they can enable printer drivers, and that means any user can just add a printer. Which, if you guys have seen the news recently, Windows is not too good at dealing with Windows drivers. It's very easy for a red teamer to get to your box and add a printer driver. That'll just give them a system on your box, which would not be good. So you want to make sure you have that disabled. And personally, you have to click through all of these for yourself and see what they do, because there's just way too many to go over, and some of them are useful, some of them are not. Kind of depends on the environment you're dealing with. So you also want to look into users and group permissions as users or rights assignments. So you have to look through basically all the groups and see what users can do what. Like if you have a random Joe Schmo who's a backup operator on your system, that's not necessarily a good thing because you don't want this random guy to be able to just take control. Because if a red team finds out that, they'll go for that user and just take control of your box. If you can find more EDRs, more monitoring tools, the more you have, the wider scope of things that you may be able to find. There's sysinternal, sysmon, process explorer, which are all very good at seeing what processes are running and what process belongs to what. If you see that your Apache is starting a command prompt, that's something you want to look into. Why are these services starting up certain things? And it's good to look into those. So to wrap up, the diagram on your right is an oversimplification of what is available. There's a lot of missing areas. They will get root minute 0 no matter what you do. It's basically impossible to stop red team from getting in your box immediately unless you just yanked out the Ethernet cables as fast as you could. But I've heard that if you do that, red team will not be a fan of that. And as soon as you plug your internet back in, they will hunt you down as hard as they can in spite of you. They will focus on you and just watch.
Also, depending on how fast your hands are, you might not even be able to rip out the Ethernet cables in time.
Yeah, because like they plug it in where you have to have like 16 different. Like if you have a cable for every box, you might not be able to get and just yank them out fast enough before red team already hacks your box. Like they're itching with their enter key. Like I've heard like they'll like there's a start time, right? But red team doesn't care about the rules. They'll hit enter a few minutes early. They're also not like there's an overnight competition, but like your blue team's not there. They're not supposed to hack overnight, but they're a red team. Do they listen to the rules? No, you may think like over the night, oh, your boxes are how you left them. Don't trust it. You have to go through the whole process again, making sure that red team didn't like change some settings or add a bunch of users overnight. They're kind of mean. They want to win. They don't want you to win either, because if they lose persistence and you did a good enough job, they can't get back in. So they will do whatever they can to make sure you can't 100% secure your box. This is in my opinion, competitions are like the best part about the defensive security field as a whole, and it's just getting to know your environment and controlling it as best you can. I really like competing against red team. It's interesting to see what they do, and learning from them is kind of fun. So how do you get good? There's a lot of things. Practice, explore, make mistakes. It's all in good fun. Unless you're in the real world, then it's less good fun if you make mistakes. So make them here in your small like security-related projects. If you set up a home lab, work towards like making it secure. Like if you just have a web server running on your home network, that may not be in all good fun if they hack into your network. So just make sure you have good security around that. Make a checklist, especially if you're competing this weekend. It might be good to go through different presentations DefSec has done, or look through OffSec presentations and look what things OffSec does to get into your boxes, because they've talked about that too, like what things to look out for and what things you can do to make sure that you win on Saturday. There's a lot of things that you can read online. Like I said, the clubs. There's a Windows internal 7th edition apparently on O'Reilly. The DSU classes, they've taught a lot from like CyberOps. They had a lot of good intro to like Metasploit and defending. Find some friends. They'll help you challenge you to like see who does better in competitions too. So some helpful links. If you want, there's a lot of example checklists, I believe, on the drive, right?
Yeah, there's some.
Yeah, you can find some checklists. Don't talk to Luke. He probably won't respond. I'm at Austin King on Slack, or Austin in Discord for Security Club or Help Night. So any questions? That's all I got.